Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is William Bernstein. His latest book, A History of Trade, titled A Splendid Exchange, was the subject of an EconTalk podcast we did back in April. Bill, welcome back to EconTalk.
Glad to be here, and once again, I'm more than a little intimidated. Bob Schiller is one heck of an act to follow.
Well, I think you'll do just fine. Our topic today is inequality. Bill is concerned about it, and I am not. It should be a lively conversation. Bill, let's start off with your basic perspective. What worries you about inequality in the United States, and in particular?
Well, what worries me, Russ, is that I don't believe that we fully understand the costs of it. And the more we learn about it, the more alarming the picture becomes. According to the standard economic model, the parable of the pie that you talk about so often on this show and so well, if someone's slice gets relatively smaller, it shouldn't matter if the overall pie is getting bigger and the smaller piece of the pie is bigger than it was before.
Smaller fraction.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, if your piece of the pie relative to everybody else's goes down by 10%, but if that actual piece is 20% bigger than what you had before because the pie's gotten so much bigger, then you should be happy. And the problem is that is really not the way human beings work. There's the famous quote of H.L. Mencken that a wealthy man is one whose salary is higher than that of his wife's sister's husband. And there are lots of other funny quotes that you can.
It's a good line.
We could spend the rest of the show on probably. But people do care about their relative place, and this has roots in our evolutionary history. Whether you survive or not, whether you got to pass your DNA along or not, depended upon your place in the pecking order. It determined how much food you got, and it also determined whether or not you got to reproduce. Because, of course, pre-modern societies, for the most part, were polygenic. You had the alpha males getting all of the females, and if you were at the bottom of the heap, you didn't get to mate, and you didn't get to pass your DNA on. So we are
hard to know whether those were the good old days or not. I guess it depends on where you were in the order.
I suspect they weren't.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But we can see echoes of this, very strong echoes of this, in a lot of modern, not only social data, but also medical data. And I'll start with the epidemiological data, which is I think, the most compelling, and I think it's also some of the most economically cogent as well. Status matters when it comes to health. What you find is that even independent of income and sanitation and the usual health habits, smoking, overweight, and so forth, simply your status in society matters a great deal. The first person who really discovered this and really elucidated what it looks like is a man by the name of Michael Marmot and another man by the name of Richard Wilkinson, two British academics, who did something called the Whitehall Study. And Whitehall, as most people in the audience know, is the street where the British Civil Service centers upon. And he looked at different groups of people who worked in the British Civil Service. And these are all people who have, not enormously different salaries. They all have good food, and they all have good health care, and they all have fairly good health habits. And what he found was that the people at the top of the heap, the mandarins, the guys who went through Oxford and Cambridge and rose straight to the top without ever touching the sides, these people lived far longer, even adjusting for income, than the people at the next level down. And then those people, the semi-administrative people, did better than the clerical people in terms of longevity. And finally, the people who worked in the support staff, even though they had college degrees, university degrees, had the shortest lifespans among the groups that he studied. And this was purely a matter of status. It really, you could easily factor out income and other health characteristics. And the thing that stood out was status. There are a lot of other examples of this as well. My favorite is that it turns out that Academy Award winners live 4 years longer on average than the runners-up, the people who don't get the Academy Award. And again, this is purely a matter of status. What epidemiologists talk about when they talk about this is something, in terms of economics, is something called the epidemiological transition. When you look at nations and you look at their mortality rates, when you look at their longevity, what you find is that below a level of about $5,000 or so in current GDP per capita. Per capita GDP is the primary economic determinant of longevity and mortality rates. The poorer you are, the poorer a nation is, the shorter people's lifespans are. But above $5,000 per year, the absolute level of income no longer matters. What does matter, and what matters greatly, is inequality. So, for example, people puzzle over the fact that the average lifespan in Cuba is only a year less than it is in the United States. And this is because, although, they're obviously penalized by the fact that their per capita GDP is only about 1/10 of what ours is, but their inequality levels are much, much lower, and that very nearly compensates for that.
Well, I think that's ludicrous, as well as those other statistical examples. So let's stop here for a moment. Let's take these three that you've just given, the Whitehall Study, the Academy Awards, and the Cuban lifespans, and let's talk about the problems with that kind of statistical analysis. Then I want to challenge you on the implications, even if they are true. But first, let me just try to give you see if I can get you to concede that maybe there's more going on there. Let's start with the Whitehall Study, which I haven't seen. I've seen the Academy Award study, by the way. It's very clever. It's very entertaining, and it has a certain poignance to it, obviously. I didn't know the Cuban data point, but that's interesting too. So let's start with the Whitehall Study. So summarize it again. Let's see if I've got it right. The higher you were in the pecking order, holding income and health constant, since health is presumably, quote, roughly the same, or health access to health care at least is.
Access and risk factors as well. The usual things: diabetes, smoking, overweight, that sort of thing.
Okay, so if you control for all those things, you found out that the people with the larger responsibilities or the higher status live longer. Do you know what the amount is, by the way? Is it 6 months, 5 years?
Well, actually, what he looked at was raw mortality rates. It's actually much easier to measure how rapidly people are dying than how long they live. Although he measured that too. But the more below, I believe the statistic is that if you look at the difference between the highest and his lowest socioeconomic or his status group, the people, the mandarins, the people at the top, and then the clerical support people at the bottom, the mortality rates of the people at the top were just slightly more than half of the mortality rates of the people at the bottom.
So the first thought there is that there's an unobserved variable which can't be measured in the statistical analysis that is causing both high status and high health. That can't be rejected, of course, by the data. So I guess the question would be, Well, that'd be my first thought. On the Academy Awards, there's a bias in the data, which is, of course, and I don't remember if they tried to control for this. A lot of people don't win things because they don't live long enough. So there's a sort of built-in correlation.
No. What we're talking, that was a study that, if anybody wants to look at it, is in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and it's actually online. But this is, this was instantaneous. I mean, there are 5 people nominated, the envelope, please, and then instantly you have 1 winner and 4 losers.
No, I understand, but let's say, as is often the case in Academy Awards, you have to be a runner-up a few times before you win. Doesn't happen to everybody. There are some first-time winners. Some performances are so extraordinary that it wins the person the Academy Award right away. But a lot of times you have people like Peter OToole, who's ruining your data because he keeps being a runner-up. He's quite old now. He could still live long enough to get one, in which case he'll boost the winning the Academy Award, get you a long life. But if he doesn't win one, he is going to, as the other folks, he's going to fall into the category of loser who died. And so if you're a runner-up early on in your career and you die young, it could be because you felt inadequate next to all those winners, but it could just be you died young and you didn't have a chance to enter the pool. So I don't know if they control for that. So that would be my second concern with my concern with that second study. With the Cuban argument, my only thought about that one is I'd like to see the data. It could be true that they only live a year less than than Americans on average. I'd like to know how they live relative to Cuban Americans who've emigrated here. But of course, there would be lots of biases in that sample because of the people who chose to leave wouldn't be the same. But I do find it interesting that so many people risk their lives to have the shorter lifespans living in the unequal United States. But very few people try to break into Cuba where they could live this long life because they'd be like everybody else.
Well, yeah, and that raises a very good point, which is, human human desires and human drives versus actual outcomes. Quite clearly, nobody, no one, if let's assume just for the sake of argument that lifespans were actually greater in Cuba, and let's assume that that's actually a statistical fact, that the Cuban health ministry isn't jiggering the figures, which
right.
I certainly would admit would be a problem.
I'm a little worried about that.
I'm a little worried about it, but on the other hand, the Cuban health system is actually fairly open. I happen to know several people who've actually worked in the, American physicians who've worked within the Cuban healthcare system, and they, I've talked to them about these statistics, and they think that they're real. I mean, they don't see, high mortality rates among relatively young Cubans. They think people do live to a ripe old age in Cuba. But I'll certainly admit that's a possibility. But people are much more impressed with the fact that your standard of living is so much higher in the United States than the fact that they live a year longer. Or even if Americans live 10 years longer than Cuba, that still wouldn't impress people all that much. I mean, I'll freely admit that people are trying to break out of Cuba, and it's not because of any health statistics. It's simply because our standard of living is so much higher.
Yeah, I think it's more than just the material as well. But let me go back to the fundamentals, and then I want to get to the economics. In these how do you pronounce it? Epidemiological.
Yeah.
In these epidemiological studies that look at mortality. You alluded to this, but is there any attempt to describe what the biological mechanism would be?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Because I say that because if Academy Award winners had shorter lifespans because they had they lived it up and lived too high and exhilarated by their victory, partied too many nights too long, we'd say, we'd explain that too. We'd say, well, it's not status, it's they got distracted from other things. So in this case, it's always easy to tell an ex post story. What is the epidemiological argument or biological argument for why inequality would lead to shorter life, other than it's consistent with some people's worldviews?
Well, it's very easy to come up with some medical narratives that underlie that, but there are certainly some facts that support it, which is that people who are under great socioeconomic stress have higher levels of catecholamines, that is to say, adrenalines. They have higher levels of cortisol, of endogenous corticosteroids, and they have higher blood pressures, and they also have higher levels of markers for inflammatory processes that relate to cardiovascular disease. There's something, for example, called C-reactive protein.
Has there ever been a systematic study of both high and low end folks? I mean, I would think, for example, that in just to take actors and actresses in general, or which are high end people, by the way, of course, they have much higher incomes, the successful ones, than the average person, or say Wall Street folks. We're taping this on September 25th, 2008. There is no Wall Street right now. All the investment banks have disappeared, and I want to come back to the impact that's going to have on inequality. But if we go back, say, 3 weeks ago, when there was a Wall Street and people made very large bonuses and had extremely high incomes relative to the average, I would think that if you did a medical survey of those folks, they would have extremely high levels of adrenaline and steroids and the third thing in their bloodstream. Aren't those folks off the charts?
No, actually, that's the funny thing. They're not.
I mean, they have very stressful lives, for example, even though they have high income.
Yeah, no, they may seem to have highly stressful lives, but they also are very highly autonomous people. They live their lives the way they want to, and their status is high. They are paid attention to, and actually, when you look at the data on people who you think are under a lot of stress, actually their levels of well-being and the levels of markers that when you measure them for these people are all relatively lower. What the cognitive neuropsychologists like to talk about is something called self-determination theory, which sounds sort of new agey, but it's actually a testable hypothesis that pans out quite well in the scientific marketplace. And basically, what SDT says is that people are satisfied really by three things: there's autonomy, there's connectedness, and there's competence. So, for example, Russ, you enjoy your connectedness to your students, and you enjoy the extreme level of competence that you demonstrate, and you also, as an academic, have a fair level of autonomy. You go where you want to, and you work on pretty much what you want to work. Nobody tells you what to do unless you're shoehorned into a committee you don't want to do. And so even though you may not be paid as much as an investment banker, your level of well-being, I'll bet, is pretty high. All right?
I like to think so.
And your levels of all of these stress markers are actually, I'll bet, pretty low if we were to measure them, even though you may feel stressed from time to time. And the same thing is true of someone who is a master of the universe hedge fund manager. He may look stressed to you, but actually this is a very autonomous individual.
We're very similar. Those folks on the hedge funds and me. No, I know what you're saying. It's an interesting point. Of course, if you contrast me with the hedge fund manager long enough, I might start to lose. You're suggesting I would lose some of my feelings of autonomy, competence, and what was the third one? Connectedness. The connectedness is going to stick around, but the other two, I might start to have some anxiety about it, I guess.
Yeah, and again, once you place your material well-being next to theirs, that doesn't make you feel terribly good about your job either. But overall, if you took the average tenured or even non-tenured professor in a major academic department, they're going to have far lower levels of all of these biological stress markers that I've just mentioned.
Well, I think that's true, but I think we're taking kind of a maybe not the best example. Again, this is selectivity bias is what it's called in statistics.
Yeah, but there's an example that I like to give, which is that go to an academic conference and pick out the 75-year-old Nobel Prize winner, okay?
Yeah.
Everybody still wants to talk to this guy. This guy is getting stroked every minute of the day.
Correct.
And this guy, and I don't know whether anyone's ever measured this, but I can almost guarantee you that Nobel Prize winners live far longer than the average tenured professor, because you take someone else, if you're a 75-year-old emeritus professor who didn't get a Nobel Prize and wasn't chairman of the department, no one's going to pay attention to him when he goes to the conference.
Actually, the chairman of the department thing works in the other direction in academic life. It's a sign of, except for my chairman, Don Boudreau, who has very high self-esteem and lots of autonomy, connectedness, and whatever, but it's not like the Nobel Prize. But I get your point. I think there's some truth to that, although, again, I'm surprised that the biology is such that being stroked and loved and adored helps you live longer. I would think it would make you a certain type of person it makes happier. Another type of person it makes miserable. It's an interesting thing. I've always assumed that people who go into acting and politics, two not unrelated fields.
Yeah. Now, there's where the rubber really meets the road here, and I want to move away from health.
Okay.
Is when you look at the sociological and the criminological data. If you look at what are the social determinants and the economic determinants of crime, of course income has a lot to do with it, but the inequality, again, has a much stronger effect. And obviously it's very difficult to separate income from income inequality, because obviously poor people have higher crime rates. But it's actually quite possible to do that, and I'll explain
I'm not sure. Is that true, by the way?
At least done in one instance.
Is it true that poor people have higher crime rates?
Yes, they do.
Throughout history?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you what studies what criminologists and what sociologists have done very sophisticated multivariate analyses of inequality and crime rates, and you find, for example, that if you plot among the 50 U.S. states and among the Canadian provinces just a simple Gini coefficient of income dispersion.
Let's explain that
in the state. A Gini coefficient is just it's a one-dimensional measure of inequality. So that a Gini ratio of 1 means that one person is earning all the income in the society and no one else earns anything. So it's a very unequal society. And a Gini coefficient of 0 means that everybody has the same income.
Okay.
So the United States, the American Gini ratio, I don't know, it's somewhere around 0.47 now. Most European countries, it's closer to 0.3. You look at underdeveloped nations, Bolivia, Botswana, places like that, and they've got Gini coefficients in the range of 0.6, maybe even as high as 0.7.
So let's go back to the state-by-state analysis.
Yeah. So what you find is that when you plot the Gini ratio versus the homicide rate among the American states and the provinces, it's almost a straight line. The correlation coefficient is very high, and the R squared, that is the amount of the homicide rate that you can actually ascribe simply to inequality, is also very high.
How about the suicide rate?
Don't know. That's a good question.
I'm extremely skeptical of that finding.
So let me finish, because there's one I think piece of data that just absolutely stands out. So you might say, well, they haven't controlled adequately. Yeah, they haven't controlled adequately for a number of variables, but particularly for income. But when you look at the Canadian provinces, first of all, the Canadian provinces all have homicide rates that are lower than the American states. But what is striking is that it is actually the poorest Canadian provinces, because of their redistributive system, that have the lowest inequality, the maritime provinces in the east. And they also have the lowest homicide rates. So in Canada, it is actually the poorest provinces that have the lowest homicide rates, because they have the least inequality, because I guess everybody's on welfare.
I find that totally uncompelling. So let me give you my problem with it and let you give you a chance to react. My basic problem, by the way, with much of these data and much of the worries that people talk about is a perception problem. I think most people have a great deal of difficulty knowing where they are in the income distribution. The example I like to use, I don't know if I've used it here at EconTalk, but the example I like to use is that most people have a pretty good idea of what their annual salary is before tax. They're not so good at giving you the annual salary after tax. They're not good at all at compensation. They often, myself included, would have trouble giving you a precise measure of what the dollar benefits are that George Mason University provides in healthcare and retirement. I know they're positive. I know it means that my after-tax income understates my well-being, financial well-being, but I don't know what that is. And moreover, I have no idea where I stand in the percentile placement of the average American, of the American income distribution. And even more, I have certainly less idea of how that percentage has changed in the last, say, 5 years or 10 years. I may have done better than I did 5 years ago, but I don't know whether I've moved up relative to others or fallen behind. Now, I do have an idea of how I'm doing relative to my brother and sister and their spouses, your H.L. Mencken example, and I might have an idea of how I'm doing relative to my immediate neighbors if they buy a fancier car or something like that than I own, which they do, by the way. But I still sleep well at night. So I don't understand the argument. Forget the statistical artifacts of controlling for the right things. Do you really believe that, for example, somebody in the state of Iowa looks around at Iowans, of which they have not the faintest clue of how they stand relative to Iowa as a whole, that they actually that affects their propensity to kill somebody, and why aren't they comparing themselves to the people in their neighborhood or the country as a whole? So to go at the province level in Canada and suggest that people, say, in Nova Scotia are more peaceable because they're more like each other in that province, of which is a vast, relatively low-density place, strikes me as a totally untenable intellectual claim.
Well, again, what you've also just done, by the way, is you've undercut the major criticism of the Piketty size data, and I'll talk about that just very briefly since I brought it up, which is, when people talk about inequality in the United States and how it's measured, I think that's the study that's their data that is cited more than anybody else.
I agree.
And
Piketty and is one of the authors, and Saez, S-A-E-Z, is the other.
Emmanuel Saez at Berkeley and Thomas Piketty, who's, I think, a Frenchman, actually.
Well, and we'll put those references up on the web.
Yeah, and their data are based primarily on, at least in the United States, on IRS data, on government tax data. And whenever you see a criticism of it, the criticism that's always made is, well, that's not what the census data show. All right. The census data show much less inequality, and there are a number of criticisms of the census data, which are, we probably don't want to talk about on this show. But obviously, if you want to know how much people make and you want to know how much inequality there is, you want to see you'd much rather see what they put on their 1040 rather than ask them how much are you making on a census form. And I think you've basically just underscored that point. Yeah, I mean, the answer.
I have a bigger problem with their study, but we'll come to that. I suppose.
We'll come to that. Yeah, I'm sure we will. But do I believe that people feel stressed when they feel disadvantaged and they lack autonomy on the job? I mean, it's not just that, it's not just that they have a small rat-infested apartment and they can see, the people in the wealthy part of town are living in McMansions, but it's also when they go to work, they have to beg their boss to go to the bathroom. If they show up 5 minutes late, they get yelled at, and the second time it happens, they get fired. That sort of status difference certainly is a cause of stress, and it's certainly a cause of mortality.
That may be, although I don't know. That may be. I don't think most people in the rat-infested apartments spend a lot of time driving through the McMansion neighborhoods, and in fact, there's a demand for people to watch the people in the McMansion neighborhoods. They seem to enjoy it, not be penalized by it. If we look at celebrity magazines and shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, people seem to enjoy seeing how wealthy people live. But putting that to the side, those observations, which are interesting and I think psychologically important and spiritually important, and I hope we can talk a little bit about this outside the raw numbers, those have nothing to do with those studies. Those studies have nothing to do. The empirical work on this issue about death rates or homicide rates or life expectancy have nothing to do with that person's daily life and workplace environment. That's an interesting hypothesis. It could be true, but it's not confirmed by those statistical results, because those statistical results are statewide data or province-wide data in the case of Canada.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, I can present data all day long, and you can, criticize it and come up with some very good criticisms. But the point is, I've yet to see any data on the opposite side of the argument. I've yet to see data that suggests that inequality is not important. I've yet to see any data, especially epidemiological data, that doesn't say anything but that economic inequality is a major determinant of health. Maybe there are data out there. Maybe people just haven't done the studies in the right way, but no one has seen them. And I don't know an epidemiologist who doesn't believe that, in this day and age, that socioeconomic status is not a major determinant of health.
I think socioeconomic levels are a determinant of health, although again, I don't know the magnitude.
Independent of income.
Right. I think that would be the challenge. I'd be surprised. Of course, I wonder, there is a confirmation bias here. I suspect many of those folks have an axe to grind, but maybe I'm being unfair to them.
I would actually accept that as a criticism, because, I go to conferences, I hear these people talk, and I think there is a bit of an axe there, but at the same, there is a bit of a bias there among some of these people, because none of these people are terribly wealthy. But at the same time, they exist in this academic meritocracy, and the last thing they want to do is present data that can be picked apart by a smarter person.
Well, I'm doing my best. I won't say I'm a smarter person, but I do think there are problems in those data. But let's go on. So we have the I can't say that word today. Epidemiological.
That's a tough one, yeah.
Yeah, it's too many syllables. I'll call it the biodata. We have the epidemiological data that suggests a relationship between inequality and health results or social phenomena like homicide. What else are you concerned about?
Well, then there's the macroeconomic data. There's the famous commission that was put together by Jack Kemp when he was running for vice president in 1996, and basically what he said was that if we got a flat tax, that our rate of economic growth would double. So that there's this idea out there that all you have to do is make the tax structure fairer, and when fairer in the libertarian sense, that it becomes flatter and less progressive, that this will increase incentive, hours worked will increase, productivity will increase, and we'll be headed towards a prosperity of the likes of which we've never seen. And it's an interesting hypothesis. And as you're as well aware of that I am, it's one that can never be really proved or disproved.
And I'm sympathetic to it, of course. Yeah. By the way, on both moral and practical grounds.
Well, and that's another issue. Is that when you have this discussion with certain people, you can actually wear them down on the data, but then they always fall back on, but it's wrong. It's wrong to steal. And that's an argument that can't be argued against. You can also make an equally strong moral argument, I think, that of the sort that gets made on the left, which is that in a wealthy society, it is immoral that there are people who are homeless, but
or who earn X times the.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. So and you can't. And the problem with moral arguments is that you really can't.
You can't argue with them.
Yeah, you can't.
But they're interesting.
You can't argue with them. But let's just look at some very broad facts here.
Okay.
All right. According to that particular argument, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Germany ought to be the poorest places on earth. All right, and Somalia, to use a really inflammatory example, should be the richest place on earth, because therefore all they have, no government is certainly not on anybody's back in Somalia. There is no government, and there are no taxes in Somalia.
Lucky them.
Purposes.
Yeah. Well,
but let me just very briefly lay out the data. So the cross-national data certainly makes you a little suspicious, Then you look at the United States, from the 40s and the 50s and on up to around, I think it was 1970, almost 1970, we had a top marginal rate of 91%. That was the golden period of economic growth. Reagan cuts the tax rates dramatically, and economic growth falls. Okay, confounding variables. It's not all tax policy. There might have been other things going on, like the oil crisis, but still, it kind of makes you wonder. And then finally, there's the icing on the cake, which is something I always like to do to get people's juices going, which is to point out that during, since 1948, during Republican administrations, economic growth was 1% lower on average than under Democratic administrations.
Yeah, I've seen those data. They're very sensitive to a couple data points, couple administrations. But of course, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm not going to ask you whether you're one or the other either. It's not relevant for the conversation. But what you're suggesting, let me try to put it a different way. I think you're suggesting that the Republicans, who historically are associated with low taxes and less progressivity, you could argue that low taxes are much more create more equality, but they're also associated with less progressivity, whereas the Democrats are associated with higher taxes, more redistribution, and more progressivity, that policy has resulted in a more successful economic regime, that inequality costs us economic growth.
Yeah, and we really haven't gotten to the reason why I believe that is. We've talked about the health effects.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
That inequality is a factor in economic growth. In fact, I'm of course susceptible to the opposite argument that inequality produces economic growth. But I'll let you finish.
Yeah, I think the way you explain it, and I find it compelling. I'm sure you won't. Is that the ultimate basis of our prosperity, as we both know, is the security of our property rights and the security of rule of law, and the person who does not feel that he's getting a fair shake out of the society is more likely to steal. The person who's who's worried about where his next meal coming from is more likely to steal. And so you wind up with a society in which 2% of the population is in jail, in which there are several million people working in the security industry, and in which there will be upwards of I believe 8 or 10 million people within the next year or two living in gated communities. So when you have increased inequality, the costs of protecting your property rights, your property right enforcement costs, increase dramatically. And I think that offsets the incentive effect. That is to say, that obviously, unequal incomes, a flat tax structure is going to produce a great deal of inequality. That will increase incentive according to the standard economic model. But I believe at the same time, it also increases your property rights enforcement costs. And I think that's what the offsetting factor is here.
Okay. Well, let me mention a couple things. First, I want to recommend a book to folks out there. I don't know if it's still in print. I'll try to find a link to it. It's a very interesting, thoughtful book. It's called The Uneasy Case for Progressive Taxation. It's by Bloom and Calvin, two University of Chicago law professors. It was written a long time ago. What they do is they look at the moral and practical case for progressive taxation, and they lay out all the arguments in favor of it, and they basically come to the conclusion that the arguments are not particularly compelling, but are a little bit compelling. So that's why they call it the uneasy case. There's some suggestion that progressive taxation might be a good idea, but they can't really make it as ironclad as they like. But whether you agree with their conclusion or not, it's a very thought-provoking book on a wide range of issues. And it's a short book, which I always think is a plus. The second thought I'd have that I think we ought to look at, and I don't have the data in front of me, but the data are out there, which is the impact of tax policy on after-tax both income and consumption. I don't think it's very large. And one of the reasons is not meaning to say that the progressive tax doesn't do much to reduce inequality, and a flatter tax wouldn't do much to increase it. Let me give you one of the economic arguments, and then maybe we can talk about it more broadly. The argument would be that if we raise, let's say we went and let's put a tax on doctors and lawyers on the argument that their services are overcompensated for a whole bunch of reasons, but let's just do it on this alleged moral ground that it's not fair, or this practical ground that you're invoking that they're living better and longer independent of their income, but because they are so much better off relative to others. So we're going to take their income at a higher rate. What that will do is, because of market forces, it's going to raise their pre-tax incomes. Now, it might not raise them dollar for dollar, but attempts to change the income distribution via tax policy, or a better way to say it, an attempt to change the financial or economic material well-being of folks through tax policy, I think had very limited success. So you can be in favor of high tax rates either because you think people of high income should be punished, or on moral grounds, or on these practical grounds, but I think the impact, or symbolic grounds, which is what I'm suggesting is the most likely result, I think the impact on their material status is really quite low at current levels. And when I say current levels, I mean sort of what modern democratic states have done. Well,
again, I don't think I can disagree with that. I would tend actually to almost to support you on that. But you may not be able to radically affect the relative distribution of income, but you can certainly offset the disadvantages of it. For example, you can use that increased tax revenue to decrease classroom sizes in inner cities. You can create more urban parks so that disadvantaged children don't have to stay in their apartments all day long, and they can get outside because otherwise they're not safe. And you can have any number of nutritional and health support programs. One statistic, and this is I think it's unarguable, and it's one of my favorite ones.
We'll see about that, Bill.
Is that you can't argue with height measurements.
Okay.
That's a tough one to jigger. And that the average Dutch male is now 5 centimeters taller than the average American Caucasian male. This is non-Hispanic, non-black, same basic ethnic stock, more or less. And that the average Dutch female is 6 centimeters taller than her American compatriot. And this is simply the result of the direction of funding into public health measures, simple public health measures. And height, as we both know, is a very good economic historical tool.
It is, but I was with you until you said simply. I can't argue with the first part. I bet they are taller, although even there, I wonder if it's done correctly. You've got to do a sample. That's pretty straightforward. I'll give you that. Let me go back to the this issue of tax policy. I like your point that if we tax the rich at higher rates, we can fund more stuff that might make the lives of the poor better. And I think what you've done there, which I think it's an interesting argument, but you've confounded the absolute levels with the inequality issue. So, for example, the argument would have to be that increasing amounts of aid to the poor, either in educational quality or daily life through parks or nutrition, would have a bang for the buck above and beyond the increase in their absolute well-being. You'd have to argue that, which might be enough for you, right? I understand that. But you're also arguing something stronger than that, right? You're trying to argue that the closing of the gap in their well-being is also going to boost their health and other issues, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I also would like to get back to something else that I want to finish your thought, which is the effects of changing tax policy and of increasing incentive through a flat tax. As you know probably as well as I do, that actually hours worked, particularly among males, is fairly inelastic to the tax rate, and that's because that there is an incentive effect which increases hours worked as after-tax pay goes up, but there's also an income effect which moves in the opposite direction, which is that when you tax people, they feel poorer, and so they have to work more hours. And so that, that when you can change marginal tax rates up and down all you want, it really doesn't affect the way the number of hours that most people will work, especially males. Females are a little responsive to that, but males, it turns out, aren't.
The measured data are very consistent with that, although one of the challenges in any of those analyses is that they're looking at a point in time. I'll just give an interesting empirical point, which is that at the turn of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, 1900s, poor people worked longer hours than rich people, and that has reversed, which is an interesting phenomenon. I don't know who made that observation first, but a number of economic historians talk about it. And one of the problems with the finding, I think it's obviously true at a point in time. I think it's true. But the real more interesting question is lifetime hours. I think high-skilled people today are working very intensely, but I suspect they are retiring earlier, and that lifetime hours might be different. But it's an interesting point.
Yeah, and as long as we're putting books up, I'll certainly read the book that you recommended. But the person whose data I trust more than anybody else's is Joel Slemrod at University of Michigan.
Very good economist.
And he's got a book out which is very accessible. It's called Taxing Ourselves with John Bakija. Joel Slemrod is certainly not a man with an axe to grind. He's strictly the facts man kind of guy. And if you want a good sense of what all of these data show, you could do much worse than reading his book. It's a superb book.
Yeah, I'll take a look at it. I want to follow up a point you raised earlier, though. We got diverted a little bit. Your point about taxing high-income folks and providing services for lower-income folks. We do that pretty dramatically in the United States. One of the things, and part of it I think is relatively unimportant, and part of it I think is very important. The relatively unimportant part is I do think that market forces work against that. Certainly on the upper end, that is, we tax the rich at a higher rate, market forces tend to provide higher pre-tax compensation and limit the impact on reducing inequality. But the other point is that right now in the United States, we talked about this in, I think, the Robert Barrow podcast, I think the bottom 50% of the income distribution contributes about 3-ish, maybe 4%. It's under 5% of the tax collections of the federal government. Now, it's a misleading number, as I've said before, and I think it's really important that people understand why it's misleading. It's a misleading number because it doesn't include payroll taxes. So when you include payroll taxes, it's obviously very different. But the problem is that most people mistakenly think that their payroll tax is like a user fee that'll earn them Social Security money. It's somewhat like that, but not very much. But I think most people forget about, ignore, et cetera, their payroll tax burden and tend to focus on their income tax burden. And when you think that the cost you of an extra dollar of government spending is a nickel, it does encourage people to demand more government spending. It's part of the reason that we are moving to we continue to spend a great deal at the federal level. And we also have, I don't know the numbers lately, we'll look them up, but a quite significant portion of the American people pay zero income tax. Obviously, at the high end, that's what gets people incensed. It doesn't incense me that people at the low end pay zero. I kind of like it. The problem, though, is what it does to the body politic. It encourages people at the low end then to, again, demand more government service because it's a free lunch for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting phenomenon that people tend to ignore the payroll tax, which, of course, is a highly regressive tax.
Regressive and and growing, right? It's an increasingly large tax.
I don't. It's interesting. I mean, the reason why that is, it's a mystery to me. And obviously you can't ignore the payroll tax. It's part of the total tax. It's part of the total tax structure.
Ideologues on both sides will talk about the income tax as if it's the only tax burden, which is a mistake.
The one thing we haven't talked about today, Russ, which is probably it's maybe for another subject for another hour, and almost certainly for someone else besides me to handle, is why the inequalities have increased so dramatically. We all have our theories, but I don't think anyone really knows.
No, I agree, but I think we should talk about that a little bit. And the reason I made the allusion to the date, which is September 25th, 2008, and the current financial turmoil that's going on and the end of Wall Street, is I want to raise a point that I think is a major flaw in the Piketty and Sayers data. It's not in their data; it's in their in the interpretation of it that many people give, including them. And get your reaction, which is that I see the income distribution in the United States as mostly emergent. That is a set of ex post results based on individual decisions by thousands and millions of people. It's, of course, it's affected by public policy. I don't want to suggest that it has a totally natural set of outcomes, but there's a largely natural outcome to it that is out of the control of anyone in particular. That is, even if the President of the United States or Congress wanted to do something about inequality, I think their options are much more limited than people think. I also believe that the current rising levels of inequality are not a conspiracy. They are not the result of public policy. I think they are the result of individual decisions and market forces that are beyond the control of individuals in Congress and public policy. So, for example, one of the factors in the rise of inequality in the United States, of income inequality, is increasing returns to education. I'm a beneficiary of that. We live in a weird internet information world relative to 25, 50, and 100 years ago. I've made this point before. 50, maybe 40 years ago, a couple of economists could make some money on the side. That was Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman writing for Newsweek magazine. Now dozens of economists make money, some not very directly when we blog, but indirectly through speaking engagements and other things, and writing for all the myriad of publications that now have a thirst for content. So it's a much better time today to be educated than it was 25 and 50 years ago. Technology has done all kinds of things to enhance the returns to be having a scarce skill. And so those are the two things that I think about that have increased the inequality in the United States. The role of education, but just technology and skill generally that is scarce, is earning a much higher return. Now, there are many other things going on as well. I don't suggest that's the only thing. But when I look at that, I think I see that mostly as a good thing because most of those folks, I think, have enhanced the lives of lots of other folks. Most obvious example I like to use is Sergey Brin, who invents Google, goes from being a poor graduate student to one of the 10 wealthiest people in America. And he didn't hurt anybody by that. In fact, he made people better off. So in times when entrepreneurial opportunity is greatest, which I would argue in the last 50 years has been in the 80s and 90s and the beginning of the 20th century until about 3 or 4 days ago, beginning of the 21st century until 3 or 4 days ago, you're going to see a lot of fortunes made. People are going to pop up into the top 1%, the top 5%, top 10%. And mostly I think that's good. And I don't know why people view that as some kind of a bad thing. In particular, I like what P.G. O'Rourke has said, and I've said it myself and stolen it, which is wealth is not a pizza. And so it's not just the fact that you're getting a bigger amount, even though your share might go down. It's the fact that that's the wrong way to think about how wealth gets carved up and handed out in a capitalist free market system, of which ours is still roughly one. So I don't see why, for example, in today's world, if you are unhappy with your status and you go to college and you get a degree in a serious subject, you're going to get ahead in the United States relative to the case than if you don't. I would argue that most of the mechanisms that were in place 20 and 30 and 40 years ago are still in place for getting ahead. It doesn't mean everybody gets ahead. It doesn't mean everybody's capable of going to college, studying something difficult and serious. And we could think about and talk about what we should do about that to help those folks. But I find it hard to believe that the current levels of inequality are the result of anything other than most people's personal choices and the system that allows them to thrive.
Yeah, let me expand on that. I don't disagree with that. I think that 95%, maybe even 100% of what you've said is true. That the increase in inequality is certainly not due to some vast right-wing conspiracy. It has to do with a skill premium, which is what you're describing. My favorite example is which I think is a little off, but it's a wonderful phrase, which is the O-ring theory of the skill premium, which is that in an agricultural society in which a farmer can perform one task with 95% accuracy, having 100% accuracy really doesn't make you that much more productive. When you're putting potatoes into the ground. But if you're working in a high-tech factory with a 300-step process, there's a big difference between performing each step with 95% accuracy, because eventually after 300 steps you'll get a zero result, versus 100% accuracy. So
the reason you call it the O-ring is.
No, the O-ring, of course, was the famous bit of sealant that failed during the 1986 Challenger shuttle launch, and that's why it exploded.
Right, a tiny piece of poorly executed material.
Yeah, just among hundreds of thousands or millions of steps that had to be performed. So it's not the result of some conspiracy, or I think not too much due. Although I think there is an aspect of government policy, but I agree it's largely due to technological factors, and these are basically a good thing. And I think the challenge is to learn how to deal with the negative effects of the inequality that produces. Certainly, I don't want to turn the clock back to the pre-modern, the pre-electronic era, but I think that it does need attention.
My guest today has been William Bernstein, author of A Splendid Exchange, as well as many fascinating books on investment, which we've never talked about on this podcast, but maybe down the road we will. Bill, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.